Welcome back for another edition of Forage Focus. I'm Christine Gelly, the Extension Educator for Agriculture and Natural Resources in Noble County, Ohio. Today, we have a special guest joining us on the show. Jonathan Kubish was on Forage Focus in January 2020, and we have him back for January 2021. Jonathan and I share some similarities in our path through the forage world, both being graduates of The Ohio State University and the University of Tennessee. Last time we talked with Jonathan, he was currently in his master's program at the University of Tennessee. But Jonathan has now moved on to another position. Jonathan, thank you for joining us for the show today. Tell us a bit about what you're up to now here in 2021.
Well, thanks for having me back on the show. And I really do think of you as my big sister in the forage world. I've moved on to Virginia Tech and I'm working under Dr. Ben Tracy in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences. My new project is an extension of what I was doing when the organic forages, in that I'm trying to integrate native wildflowers into some of our forage systems in order to better serve some of the needs of both our beef and our bees. And the project is appropriately called Bee Friendly Beef.
I know that there's quite a few people in my area that have interest in both of those ventures as well. We have a lot of beekeepers that are also beef producers, and we can certainly promote habitats that are friendly for both. So we look forward to hearing more about what you explored during your time at Virginia Tech and how that progresses along. Jonathan, something that I've learned about you in our time being colleagues is that you have a specific interest in native plants and specifically native clovers. Can you tell us a bit about your background working with those plants and what intrigues you about them and what you're doing now?
Well, of course, I started out working for the Department of Conservation in Missouri, which really directed me into the importance of grasslands as a whole, both our introduced pastures as well as some of our pre-existing ecosystems. When I came back from that summer in Missouri to Ohio State, I started taking a class with Dr. David Barker, who we both know, and he was looking for a student who was able to work with some of his native clover material. Being who I am and how interested I was, I naturally took it upon myself to try and play with these plants and learn a little bit more about how do these native plants fit into the world that we've built in the time since Columbus. The land use in Ohio and a lot of the eastern United States has changed a fair bit. We don't have a lot of bison, we don't have elk, we have a lot more white-tailed deer, and we also have cattle in our landscape. So the way that we consume forage and use forage is different. The kinds of grasslands that we have are quite different than what were here before, and they've expanded quite a bit compared to Ohio generally being a woody kind of state. So in the world of native clovers, I was very interested in seeing if they still have a place in the modern world. And a lot of my early work in undergraduate research was trying to figure out where they would fit into areas around Noble County, such as reclaimed mine land in Tuscaroras and similar places. The idea being that these native clovers are part of our natural heritage. Let's see if we can use them for economic benefits and for conservation outcomes. In the time since graduating Ohio State, I've gradually made contacts with a lot of people in the clover world, and the eastern United States is just popping with all of these different native species for just about each state.
That's incredibly interesting, Jonathan. And for some of our viewers who may be watching, um, so are you telling me that white clover and red clover aren't native?
Yes. Of the, say, 17 species that you may see in Ohio and Kentucky, only 2 or 3 are actually native to this part of the United States. Um, a lot of our native clovers are associated with the bison and the elk that we used to have in this area. And so the seeds that we use from red and white clover came over with European settlers, especially when they were trying to introduce small grains and forages. It's kind of the same way that Kentucky bluegrass is not originally from Kentucky. It's some of these introduced grass species to try and build permanent pastures in the eastern US. A lot of our pre-settlement grasslands have these big periods of growth and big periods of slumps, which compared to the summer slump and fescue, even more of a dearth. So Europeans brought over a lot of introduced forages to try and maintain a steady supply, much as we're trying to do today as both producers and researchers. White and red are both from Europe, the Near East, and parts of Northern Africa, in the same way that tall fescue is from that same region. A lot of our forages come from Europe, where animals graze a lot more intensively and for a lot longer at each grazing event.
So, Jonathan, what are some of those that are at your top of the list as far as intriguing forages to consider and continue developing?
To quote the great Henry Freeburg, the way that we take a novel forage and we move it from idea to reality is literature, followed by a pot study, followed by small plots, and then into grazing studies, at least from the research side. Plants that I've investigated and gotten as far as the pot study include running buffalo clover, which I worked on a lot at Ohio State. This is Trifolium stoloniferum. There is another one also called buffalo clover. I usually call it annual buffalo clover, called Trifolium reflexum. And this has been investigated as a potential ornamental species or as a pollinator resource. There's a recently described species called Kentucky clover, Trifolium kentuckiense, and I actually have some of the seed right here for a little bit of show and tell, but this species was recently described in 2013, and there's been a lot of work from the state of Kentucky about trying to increase the population. Again, this might be a great pollinator resource, and we're trying to investigate where it fits into a grazing landscape. These seeds right here actually come from a cow pasture near Lexington, Kentucky. There are two more species that are a little bit further out for an Ohio viewer, but they're kind of proximal to the Ohio River Valley. This includes running glade clover, which occurs in the Nashville Basin in very, very western Virginia, and that's Trifolium calcaricum. And then if you drive along the interstate in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and parts of Virginia, you'll see Trifolium virginicum, which is Cape Mountain clover. And it's in these shale barrens where not much else will grow. And these are just fascinating species that fit into these roles that we don't really think of in the landscape as much anymore.
Yeah, Jonathan, I've got a couple of questions just about the naming of some of those clovers. I've heard the name running multiple times now. What is that running referring to when we talk about those plants?
That's a great question, Christine. Running refers to the generally to the runners on some of these clover species. So when we talk about running buffalo clover, and the vegetative spread of the plant is done by growing along these runners. The same is true for the running glade clover here in Tennessee. This has also at points, because these names were assigned earlier on, and it's very hard to figure out the origins of some of these names, but one of the other thoughts for running buffalo is that the hoof action of the bison across the landscape helps scratch the seed coats and help promote germination for that species. And there's been some questions about how those common names actually come out of the literature, because a lot of these plants have been pretty poorly investigated and most were kind of ignored for the past 100 years. So we aren't really sure if it's some of these things tied to necessarily the running habit or to the hoof action.
So when you look at conservation of these species, you've described the research steps to evaluating and categorizing these clovers, observing how they grow. When it comes time, like that we decide that this plant is worth conserving and investigating, how do you motivate people to get involved in that process? What's your first step, say, for plant propagation?
Well, that's actually another great question about trying to get people involved in plant propagation. One of the great things when it comes to the land grant system here in the United States is that it's very easy to go between the worlds of conservation and agronomy. Very often we have very well-meaning ecologists and conservationists who need some of our tools in agronomy to make their plants grow. So when it comes to things like plant propagation, We do experiments where we see whether we can get runners to grow when separated from the mother plant and what kind of conditions are needed to promote the growth of these plants. Scarification is another reason that we can know in agronomy how to get things going for things such as crown veg. And some of these other questions that we ask, which are often used in a production setting, are very useful when it comes to practical land management. How high should we cut our vegetation in order to allow these clovers to grow? How much bare soil do we need for these plants to run and establish? And what are the fertility needs in order to succeed when we go and plant, as I did in 2017 back in Cincinnati?
Speaking of fertility, Jonathan, are we finding through recent studies that these native clovers also have that beneficial relationship with rhizobia where they can um, create nitrogen in the soil? Are we seeing that as well in these plants?
The good extension answer is it depends on the species. Running buffalo clover is very notable because it's one of the few legumes that does not nodulate in the same way that redbud trees, while being legumes, don't nodulate. A few of the other species do nodulate and they do form these really dense nodules, but it hasn't been quantified in the same way that we have in research studies with alfalfa, white, and red clovers. Um, the general rule of thumb when we grow them in the greenhouse for conservation is that the annual species of these native clovers will make nodules, whereas the perennials will not, which
Hmm.
suggests that there's a need for a specific inoculum or a specific rhizobium that we're going to have to add when we grow these things out for larger reintroductions.
Okay, well, another question that I have related to this um, is about germplasm. So, folks who have been involved in conservation of seed throughout various aspects of agriculture know what germplasm is, but some of our viewers probably, for one, don't know the word germplasm, and two, don't know the importance of building resources in germplasm libraries. So there are germplasm laboratories and libraries across the United States that specialize in different types of seed and preservation of genetics. Um, Jonathan, can you tell us a bit more about how the germplasm library plays into conservation of these species?
One of the greatest things about the genus Trifolium, and this is not just for my native clovers that we're speaking about today, but just about every species in the world has been collected and is deposited in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There was a specialist, a clover breeder down at the University of Kentucky who was Norm Taylor, and he made it a goal to collect all of the world's clover species and try and capture all of the genetic diversity available in the genus. One of the side benefits for native clover conservation is that Norm made it a goal to collect these species as well. And so we have some of the best seed banks for native plants ever just because we had a clover guy who really cared. Now, Norm passed in 2010, and his collection's been divided into annual and perennial species. And these are deposited in Pullman, Washington, and in Griffin, Georgia, at the germplasm centers there. The good news is that a lot of this material has paperwork that ties it back to Norm's collections, and there's work underway to try and figure out what natural populations these seed collections come from. So this is useful because one, it allows us to do research on plants without having to go out in the wild and collect material. And also, we are hoping to eventually use these as practice runs for expanding the available plant material. And depending on when we get some of these species off the endangered species list, we'll be able to start doing things like improving them for use in forage systems.
Well, that's great news. And of course, when we think about the timeline from discovery or recognition of one of these clovers that's worth additional investigation, I mean, it's going to be a number of years before we make progress on getting a full stand established somewhere where we can look at the impacts of grazing and haymaking. Jonathan, do you have any estimate on from start to finish, from the time we take that seed out of storage to begin investigating to having something growing for a large scale study in the field? Through your experience in reading, how long does that process take?
Well, one of the best examples for taking seed and trying to apply it for field level research is some work being done at Eastern Kentucky University, and that's just up the road on I-75. The work there is more of an ecological study, but they found that using light cattle grazing was important for promoting their running buffalo clover plants and increasing the spread of the stand. They're trying to include things that we generally don't think of as agronomists, such as developmental stages and trying to get indices of maturity. But some of these resources are great for our eventual use when we're setting recommendations for how much of a stubble height we should leave when grazing these pastures, what sort of persistence we should expect from these plants. And a lot of the work done at Eastern Kentucky has been in the last 15 years or so. So hopefully, as we keep getting more people involved and a lot more of these institutions invested in putting out field populations and doing research of that sort, we should be able to see things speed up beyond that 15-year wait time.
That's excellent news. And a question that I have, again, relating back to this from a beekeeper's perspective, are there ways that people who are interested in native insects and other native organisms that they can be helpful in this mission of native forages as well? Is there a way they can play together?
Absolutely. One of the big things that's being done on a practical level for using native plants has been the Conservation Reserve Program. And that historically has covered a lot of our mission of trying to incorporate some of these native plant species. A lot of times we think the native warm season grasses into our landscapes. However, bees play an extremely important role in a lot of our clover breeding efforts and a lot of our clover conservation work. At Ohio State, we coordinate with the honeybee lab to be able to encourage the pollination of the clovers. However, in the wild, a lot of that pollination would be done by a lot of our native bees. And there is still work to be done about pollination ecology and a lot of incorporation there. Hopefully, as we start doing more work and we start putting more plants out, there'll be some interest in trying to figure out what sort of pollinator resources we need to put out. A great study that just came over from England suggests that in the same way that when we manage our cattle, we need to maintain a constant supply of grass or just in general forage, the same is true for bees. And we need to maintain consistent forage throughout the growing season, especially towards the end.
I'm thinking here on my side, Jonathan, about citizen science projects and ways that the average citizen can become involved in programs like this, being involved in conservation in various aspects. And an example that came to mind was Ohio State recently, this past summer throughout 2020, did a citizen science project surveying native bee populations. Um, and I think that that has been greatly successful so far. What are some ways that people could become involved in citizen science projects related to the native plants, native clovers, like you've discussed today?
When it comes to citizen science projects regarding a lot of these clovers and native plants, some of the best ways to get involved are to get together with local park districts, as well as some of the native plant societies. Ohio is very lucky because it has two. There's one up in Cleveland, and then there's the Cincinnati Wildflower Preservation Society, as well as several Facebook groups where enthusiasts get together to talk about both going and looking at some of these rare and special native plants, as well as doing things to improve their native habitat. So, in the short term, it's very helpful to support these local conservation efforts, both financially and, when possible, go out there and help pull up things. In a lot of Ohio woodlands, we are concerned with things like bush honeysuckle, and garlic mustard. And these are also threats to the native clover species in the state. And so being able to just be willing to spend an afternoon pulling up weeds or hacking away at honeysuckle is always a plus and always helpful. As some of these plants get rolled out, there'll be more opportunities open up to actually have a few plants in your backyard. And there's been some work in Kentucky about trying to do collaborative work with landowners, which should hopefully spill across the Ohio River maybe in the next 3 or so years. So be on the lookout for opportunities. And if you have interest in some of these species, one of the best ways to get in touch with people is to join some of these conservation groups, because the experts will be glad to show you plants and show you how they fit into the local ecosystem.
And we're still here working within the pandemic situation. And from my understanding, these societies have continued to meet and socialize with each other through various means. Do they have webinar recordings, magazines, newsletters that people can sign up for?
Absolutely. There are newsletters coming out regularly for several of the nearby plant societies. For those of you who may be closer to Lexington or to Charleston, West Virginia, both the West Virginia Native Plant Society and Kentucky Native Plant Society regularly put out newsletters with information about some of these native clovers. Depending on which wildflower society you're affiliated with, the frequency may differ, and a lot of these announcements are over Facebook. Some of the good webinars that are available now, and I would recommend, are the Kentucky Native Plant Society had a botanical symposium recently, and they actually discussed a lot about conservation horticulture, where we apply some of our best techniques in plant science to some of these underserved species.
We will share some of those resources at the end of today's program so that if people want to become involved in some of these close to Ohio or within Ohio organizations or access those resources, they certainly can. Jonathan, throughout our talk today, we've focused mostly on clovers, and the average producer here within Ohio is going to be managing a grass and clover stand mixture. When we look at the benefits of having those two types of forages mixed together, what benefits do we specifically see from the addition of clovers, whether native or non-native?
Well, one of the first reasons that we often think of when we go to using a grass clover stand is that we're looking at the nitrogen fixation of the clover. The clovers are within the legumes, and they're able to nodulate and use all kinds of bacterium that are able to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into useful forms of nitrogen for our plants. Here in the science world, we've been debating how that works, but that nitrogen credit is crucial when we're trying to factor it in and consider potential economic savings. When we have a stand that's over 30% clover, 70% grass, it's almost entirely self-sufficient in terms of nitrogen requirements. And this is great for a producer who's looking at increasing prices, especially given that we're using things like urea, which volatilize. Why let nitrogen go back to the atmosphere when you can get it sucked into the ground? Another benefit with using some of these legumes is that things like white clover patch into parts of our pasture that might be a little roughed up after winter feeding, or just in general if we have a rough grazing event or a few abnormal conditions. Having something that's able to fill in between bunch grasses like orchard grass and occasionally tall fescue is very helpful in trying to maintain a consistent ground cover, which is great for erosion as well as for just being productive.
I absolutely agree. And one of the practices we see folks do a lot that is easy to convince them to try is frost seeding clovers. Do you have any tips for those who may be considering frost seeding here over the next couple months?
Well, one of the rules that was developed actually at the University of Tennessee and applies very well when it comes to frost seeding is to use 2 pounds red, 4 pounds white clover, and applying that frost seeding in late February and early March. And this is, of course, to the acre. But doing that every 3 years or so has been shown to be very good about maintaining clover in the stand. Another consideration for if you're going to miss it this year, but might want to do so in 2022, is to consider trying to do herbicide management for your broadleaf weeds here moving into the late summer and fall, trying to catch some of those weeds and some of your winter annual weeds, and then doing frost seeding next year. There are some new herbicide options coming onto the market, such as Proclova, which is supposed to be safe on white clover, but being able to frost seed also gives you another option depending on what your economics are pushing you to do.
Certainly. And of course, the residual time that that herbicide may hang around in the soil depends on the specific herbicide that you're choosing. So that's something to think about when you look at the label. How long will you need to wait before introducing those legumes back into the stand? But when we look at the stand and we try to evaluate things as a whole, including weed management and species composition, a lot of folks get tied up on, I don't want to treat my weeds because I'm going to kill my clovers. And one of the benefits, I think, here, one of the good things is that for the most part, those clovers are fairly easy to reestablish into an existing grass stand. So if you have a broadleaf weed problem that needs addressed, make that a priority and address it, and then come back in and add those clovers in, either through frost seeding or interseeding during the spring, even sometimes in the fall. That can be a successful venture as well. So nothing in this world works out perfectly for a forage producer, but there's many options for you to consider and still be successful. We find that the introduction of clovers is also going to benefit you from a nutritional standpoint for your animals. You're going to get an increase in crude protein from the presence of those legume crops. And really, when it comes down to selecting which one you should use, one or two or three, you need to choose the one that best fits your site conditions, including your soil texture, soil pH, and your management style. Jonathan, we thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Forage Focus. We hope to have you back again in the future. Excited to see where you go next. And if you'd like to give any shout outs to people back home, feel free.
Well, thanks again for having me on, Christine. I'd like to thank my current advisor, Ben Tracy, my former advisors, Renata Nave and Dave Barker, my postdoc, Victoria Xiong, my colleagues, both past and present, and at this point, my fiance, Sarah Grace Holland. She's been really supportive in the forage world, and can't wait to get her out there and teach her more about all this grass I keep talking about.
We look forward to seeing all of your ventures develop. And if people have additional questions for you, what's the best way to contact you, Jonathan?
Well, I've recently got a new email, and I'm sure we'll link that below, but it's just all lowercase, no space, Jonathan Kubesch, Kubesch, at vt.edu.
Great. We hope that you'll get some emails sent your way, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks so much for joining us. And for our audience, please join us again next month for another edition of Forage Focus.